there are times when I have felt I just want that bigger, thicker snare sound or that punchier kick. And so we've dived into this world of the hybrid drum set with some drum samples, and I thought I'd walk you through what we've tried, what has worked well, mistakes that I've made, if you're curious about implementing something similar at your church. All right, so hopefully you could hear the difference there between non-samples and sampled drums. Here on this snare drum, we do have a top and bottom 57 mic that we are blending into that snare sound. And then we have a single Shure Beta 52 on the outside of our kick drum. So no inside getting the click of the drum. The way that we're getting samples into our live mix is with these Roland triggers. The dual 30HR trigger from Roland for the top of the snare, and then the Roland 30K trigger on the top of the rim of the kick drum. And then those are feeding in to our Roland SPD-SX sample pad. Then on the sample pad, we have loaded different wave samples. So when we hit the snare and the kick, it's going to actually activate that send of that sample hit out of our SPD-SX on independent outputs from the SPD to our M32 front of house soundboard. So that way we can have independent control of those samples. Now I'll go through the setup with you of some of the settings on the SPD a little bit later in the video, but let me just show you the difference in some of the samples that we have purchased and tried from various places and tell you which ones we have settled on and why. The snare drum we're using live is the Black Magic snare, not the Black Beauty. It's kind of a cheaper version of it, but it sounds great on its own. But the sample that we've chosen to go with it for the snare is the Ish Signature sample from Perks Live. Ish plays at Gateway. He's got a great channel here on YouTube. I'll link in the description. But this is what that sounds like. Also from Perks Live, we are using the Gretsch 22 sample for our kick drum, and I really like the punchiness and body that it adds. Our Beta 52 is picking up more of that like subby sound, and we're kind of losing a little bit of the punch. We have flown subs in here, and so sometimes in the room even we lose a little bit of that punch that you want in the kick. So blending those two together has really sounded nice. So let me go through these snare samples that we've tried. I'll indicate on the screen what these are and where you could purchase them from. So I'll start with the Ish sample and kind of show you how that sounds. Bear with me, I'm not a drummer. You get what you get for this, okay? Let's move on to the next sample. All right, let's try out the Rogers Maple. Here's the Sebas Signature. This is the Big Snare MC. It has a little more reverb built into the waveform. This is Snare Big 6. I actually downloaded this one from Multitracks. Showed a lot of promise, but it just had a little too much of that gated reverb, plate reverb, whatever it might be. And so it just didn't fit as well with this snare drum. And I think that's something you have to keep in mind, is how does it blend with your existing snare? So the other part of the equation is setting up the SPD. Some of the settings that we've got here for our snare sample is, for the sub outs, you're going to pan your snare to the left or right and your kick to the opposite side. That way you have independent outputs. So here on our first menu, the way you get to this is you're going to go to menu and then kit and hit enter on the pad section. Click on the snare so you can see it firing there. If we click on the drum of the kick, you can see it fires there and it pulls it up. So now we're on our snare and we've got our volume set at 100. Pan is all the way to the left. That way it has independent output. Mute group off, tempo sync off. Mode is single, loop off. Trigger type shot. Dynamics is on. Poly mono is poly. And then sub is interesting because you could assign another sub sample to kind of blend in there, but since we're already blending our natural snare in, we don't need 4 different snare sounds, right? And that was something that I was confused about at first. So I would probably just leave that unassigned unless you want something really specific. The way you change your sample is just plus and minus here. We got our kick a little bit softer on the volume here, pan to the right, mute group off, tempo sync off. And then again, we don't need that extra sample, that sub sample you could throw in there if you wanted to. Now the first thing you need to do is dive into the setup menu of your SPD, go into trigger input and change that to your RT30HR and your RT30K. They're built in, it's got the settings already kind of pre-built in there for you since it's all Roland. The other thing you can do in the setup menu is go into your pad sensitivity and play with your thresholds here. We've got our snare trigger at those, pad sensitivity 6, threshold 14, velocity curve is linear. And our kick sample is pad sensitivity 7, threshold 10, velocity curve loud 1. The other settings in that detail menu, I'm not completely sure about. I didn't actually change these. I just left them at the default settings for each one, but you could play with that. So here's a couple of tips that we've learned after trying to implement these. First one is that I would not include the samples into your headphone mix for your in-ears of your players. That way, if there is any false triggering, they aren't getting that and getting confused. And the second one is this. We have a couple songs here and there where, you know, our guy is turning off the snares and playing without snares, just playing it open. So how do we make it where the triggers aren't triggering every time we don't want them to? You could program a separate cue over here to where you just hit the plus button to a new kit. But these were happening pretty quickly in a song. And so what I did was actually implemented MIDI. And it's not as easy as you think. We run our tracks through ProPresenter and our soundboard is an M32. We can fire MIDI notes from ProPresenter. The M32 accepts MIDI commands for muting on and off channels. Should be easy, right? Not so fast because it is MIDI CC, I believe, information. It's not MIDI notes that the M32 needs. It needs control information over MIDI. Well, ProPresenter can't do that. Multitracks playback can. I don't know if Loop Community Prime can. Ableton, I'm sure can. So we had to implement Bohm MIDI translator in between. And so now, whenever a note is fired on our ProPresenter timeline, it actually tells Bohm to translate that note and send over on channel 2 to our M32 at that channel 25 to mute the snare drum's trigger sound automatically. Worked flawlessly this last weekend, and I've heard really great things about Bohm, so we did pay the money to have that pro version. Now, if you don't have a Roland SPD-SX, you actually can do this with just all-in-one units. Roland makes the Roland RT Mic S that actually attaches directly to the snare drum. and you can load samples via, I think, SD card right directly onto it and output from it. It's a pretty clean setup. North Church in OKC turned me onto that one and showed me how they use it without doing something like this. So if you want to try that out, I will leave links into the description to the triggers that we use here, the Roland SPD-SX, and even that little guy, because I've heard good things about it. So there you go, guys. That was just a sampling of our drums. And I'm not married to this. We may change this next week. But so far I'm liking it. You know, if you're somebody who's done this hybrid drum kit thing for a while and you've got other tips and tricks, let us know in the comments. I love learning from you guys. But remember, we can do a lot of great things. Let's do it all for God's glory. We'll see you in the next one.